Chester Borrows.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Interesting to hear the tirade that's coming from the other side as they seek to elevate themselves in terms of protecting victims' rights. Just as in government they sought to elevate themselves as being harder and harder on crime. And it's very interesting to note the number of things that they didn't do, along with the number of things they haven't supported that have come up within the House that actually address things such as preventing crime and the causes of crime and looking after victims. For instance, remember the tirade we got on the introduction of the DNA legislation that took DNA of everybody who was arrested for an imprisonable offence. Remember the long speeches we heard, for instance, from Moana Maki, who told us what terrible things you could do once you secured the DNA from somebody who had been arrested for an offence. What that piece of legislation does is it allows us to isolate the DNA profile of somebody so that for a minor offence, so that at some stage in the future, if further and more serious crimes are committed against victims, they can be identified early. That is probably the most significant piece of legislation that's been introduced to this House that will prevent victims being violated in very serious ways than we've done in 100 years. That single piece of legislation, and all we got were brickbats from the other side of the House in respect of that. Then the previous speaker was talking about this government having done nothing for victims. What about the Child Protection Bill? Now, the other side of the House will very quickly say, we drew up a Child Protection Bill, we introduced it into the House, and it did a whole lot more than what you're doing. When did they introduce that into the House? 4 days before it rose to fight the 2008 election. And why was it introduced then? Because they were too busy self-promoting themselves in terms of the Electoral Finance Act to actually get on with the business of protecting the citizens of this country. And then in the whole course of this debate, they've ramped on, banged on and on and on about victims. And they have failed through the whole term of their government, through those 9 long years, they failed to address the victims who are languishing within our cells and they're victims of crime. They talked about, the previous speaker talked about the Victims' Rights Act introduced in 2002. Well, that was a replacement for the Victims' Rights Act introduced by the National Party prior to them leaving government in 1999, and they waited 2 years before they did anything about replacing that. So it's all very interesting to hear the other side of the House accuse this side of the House for actually doing some stuff while they're in government in respect of victims, and yet they have wasted and squandered the opportunities that they had to do things while they were in government themselves. What this bill does is that while it maintains the integrity of those people who are in jail to make sure that they receive the best of treatment, and it punishes those who would keep them in a manner that does not give them the best of that treatment that they deserve as inmates held at the bequest of the Crown, having been sentenced for crime. While it does that, it prevents them from accessing big amounts of monetary compensation that should rightfully find its way to the victims of their crimes. And the other side of the House is going to vote for it. In fact, almost everyone in the House will vote for it. We haven't heard one single reason why the Labor Party is supporting this piece of legislation, other than their banging on about the fact that they might have thought about it first. Well, any sensible government would have. We don't try and claim a whole lot of points for promoting a piece of legislation they put in. They agreed with it. It transitioned through the Justice and Electoral Committee very, very speedily because of the ability to compromise and understand each other regardless of what side of the House we come from on that particular committee, and the sterling work of that committee.